Hello, everyone. Welcome to the lecture series of We Go Smart City Champions. My name is Daniel Oh, professor at Korea University, and I'm heading the Department of Smart City at Korea University. Today, we live in a world where digital transformation is taking place everywhere we look. To me, change is fundamental to our civilization. But what's concerning to me about smart cities is that not many people are questioning the impact of all these technology on ourselves as individuals, as well as on our society as a whole. Most smart city technologies and services are developed and serviced by private companies with private interests. And these companies are designed to maximize returns on their investment and to please their shareholders as well as their consumers. But cities are not made up of consumers. Cities are made up of citizens. We need to protect and perpetuate public welfare. In order to do that, we need to be vigilant about the needs of those people who does not have a voice. When it comes to digital technology, we have to constantly make trade-offs, which means we need to prioritize and maximize efficiency within given parameters and limitations. During that process, we should be careful not to undermine the value of human beings and the environment. We should not make the same mistakes that we made over the last 100 years when industrialization and modernization transformed our cities. Today, in 2022, we cannot talk about smart cities without digitalization, globalization, and urbanization. And today's lecture will help you think critically and offer valuable insights that you would need to build healthy, sustainable smart cities of the future. Without further ado, let me introduce our lecturer, Daniel Karimi. He's an experienced CEO across the field of technology development, communication, finance, and international relations. He also led the information technology and electronics industries at the World Economic Forum. He developed relationships with the leaders, executives, of the top technology companies in the world, senior policymakers and regulators, and was responsible for shaping industry agenda. Daniel has a track record of delivering projects in corporate strategy, national and corporate digital transformation, ESG, and economic diplomacy in developed, emerging, and frontier markets. With his years of insights, I'm positive our students will be able to get indirect experience of emerging challenges across the field of digital transformation, global cooperation, and urban development. Now, please welcome today's lecturer, Daniel Karimi.
Hello, what a privilege to be in such an accomplished and energetic company. I am very grateful to WeGo for coming up with a Champions program, as well as absolutely delighted to be a small part of it. I wish you all the best for your projects that will come in the second half of the program, and I really, truly wish that next time I address you, it will be in person. But before I start, I wanted to ask just a few questions. Please take a minute and really think back and come up with an answer for yourself and perhaps for those around you. How many of you are connecting from a city right now versus from a village, from a beach, and so on? How many of you were born in the city? Is that the same city that you live in today? Were your parents born in the city or your grandparents? How many generations back do you have to go so that you can say, this was my relative that have moved to the city? The cities have been around for more than 5,000 years, and yet only about a decade ago, in 2009, did the number of people living in urban areas exceeded the number of living in the rural areas. So the world is now more urban than rural. For the past several decades, ever since I remember myself, the three main forces of modern life, if you will, the certain aspects that of our very uncertain lives were globalization, digitalization, and urbanization. This troika brought peace and prosperity to large parts of the world, especially Asia. And yet, in early 2020s, all these three forces were increasingly seen as an apocalyptic horsemen of deprivation, polarization, and radicalization. I myself have always lived in cities, and yet in the beginning of the pandemic, I discovered the beauty of small towns, fresh air, and not waiting for an elevator on a 22nd floor for 20 minutes because the pandemic restrictions do not allow more than 2 riders. And yet I really miss the buzz of big metropolis. So how and why do we decide where to take our residence, spend our productive and retirement years? In my mind, the urban evolution is tied closely to the history of agricultural and industrial revolutions, and therefore that of the technological progress. From the time when agriculture presented more and more feasible alternative to hunting and gathering, to the time when industrial revolution created incentives for labor to concentrate in cities, to the birth of the knowledge economy that created the business centers as we know it. The story of our cities was always about security, livability, and productivity. People normally differentiate between agricultural and industrial revolutions and their impact on our systems of production, consumption, which in turn affect our living environment and political systems. Over the centuries, we witnessed at least 3 agricultural revolutions and 4 industrial ones that have impacted our cities. Now, what is an industrial revolution? It could be defined as appearance of new technologies and novel ways of perceiving the world that triggered a profound change in economic and social structures. Now, why everybody talks about the 4th industrial revolution these days? If you think about it, the first one, beginning in the late 1700s, was all about mechanization. It used a steam engine that introduced mechanized agriculture and textile manufacturing. Steamships and railroads revolutionized transportation. Agrarian societies gave way to urbanization as the world began to rely on steam power, machine tools, and new factory systems. Then comes the second one, in the late 19th century, and it was about electrification. The introduction of electricity to industry enhanced the growth the mass production capabilities of industries. Electric lighting, radio, telegraph transformed the way people communicated. The second industrial revolution ushered in really the modern world as we know it. The workers left rural homes to move to the urban areas in search of jobs. In the United States, 40% of populations lived in cities in 1900s, compared to only 6% in 1800. So a century before that. The third industrial revolution is about digitalization. It brought semiconductors, mainframe computing, personal computing later on, and the internet. All that ushered in the digital revolution. But now comes the fourth one. And the fourth one is building upon all those previous efforts of mechanization, electrification, informatization, and builds in a system such as AI, machine learning, blockchain, and crypto, new discoveries in biotech, in quantum tech, you name it. But it's not only about transforming the means of production, it's also about very much the way this enables the new methods of consumption, of learning, of communication. The fourth industrial revolution is characterized by the unprecedented advances in technology, transforming the ways individuals and groups across society live, work, and interact. It also brings in new principles, protocols, rules, and policies that are needed to accelerate the positive and inclusive impact of these transformations, while minimizing and eliminating, ideally, the negative consequences. The institutions that have traditionally had the responsibility of shaping the societal impact of the technologies, including governments, companies, civil society organizations, are all struggling to keep up with the rapid change and exponential impact of the technologies. And at the same time, an implosion of confidence is occurring around the world, as trust in many institutions is actually at the lowest point. Now, according to the OECD, the city productivity tends to increase with the city size. Doubling with city size is found to be associated with an increase in productivity between 2 and 5%. So for years, having cities, top global cities, was all about national competitiveness. And yet, the pandemic rushed in the realization that cities need to be also human-centric. And the slogan since then became a mantra among urban planners. At the same time, it's counterintuitively, but as cities become human-centric, they will become more and more technology-driven. From drones to AVs, autonomous vehicles, from facial recognition to services enabled by efficient buildings, new types of streets and dwellings that we will be encountering, it will all be populated not only humans, but increasingly by machines. In the last couple of years, a number of smart city projects have been announced that had been announced a decade earlier and were actually discontinued, were canceled, postponed, or remain in limbo. Many reasons for that: regulatory backlash, privacy concerns, lack of availability of local government finances due to the pandemic. And yet, I personally think that this is not the end of the wave of urbanization. It's just the dynamic change of this urbanization. And this year, 2022, is the year when new urbanization revolution will likely to take shape. And you, WeGo champions, will be very active part of that change. It will be rushed. 2022 will see the era of the fourth urban revolution, if you will, that will require systemic views on interconnected issues of land, energy, water, climate, health, technology, economy, security, and governance. All of this will be data-driven. The fourth urban revolution will require us to rethink how we harness, process, and monetize data that enables urban services. It will force us to analyze the intersection of augmenting and colliding governance mechanisms in order to break the data silos, unite national security, global trade, and emerging technology governance mechanisms that will be shaping the future of our cities. By merging the biological, physical, and digital worlds, the fourth urban revolution will transform the way people live. The rate of change unleashed by it is truly unprecedented, impacting all societies around the globe, although at a different speed. As I mentioned, new principles, protocols, rules, and policies will be needed to accelerate the positive and eliminate the negative impact of those transformations. The political nature of emerging technologies, not in the sense that they are derived from right or from left, but rather the technology really embodies values, assumptions, and principles that affect how and who they impact in the society. Technology is not neutral, but it is impartial. The ideas that go into technologies, the ideologies of developers that create them, the norms and values that the context within which they are developed and deployed, all impact how they will be applied and what the outcomes will be. We are all familiar with examples where artificial intelligence systems may have racial biases, or machine learning or robotics will have a gender assumptions, such as service robots will have female characteristics, while industrial robots will have more male characteristics. Or all the questions around, the ethical questions around rapid advances in biological space, genome editing on humans and animals. The political nature of advanced technologies require our attention and governance because we are building our economies, societies, and the world based on those technologies. Now, what will the future urban leaders like yourself have to deal with? First of all, interdependency. Define the dynamic of dependence among elements or components of a system. Interdependency is a byproduct of a globalization and technological progress. It is a defining feature of today's world, where issues and risks conflate with each other, they create domino effect, they cascade and amplify each other. The second issue that the leaders like yourselves will have to deal with is a complexity, which is measured by three elements: the amount of information with the number of components in the system. Second, the connection between those pieces. And third, the non-linear change that is created in one component and leads to the change in the system. It's also characterized by absence of visible causal links sometimes between these elements. The third element that you will have to deal with is velocity of change, driven by technological advances. The culture of immediacy that is required by the human population of these days. We want the information to travel instantly around the world. We want, just-in-time supply chains to actually right away 1 hour delivery of our food and so on. And finally, you will have to deal with transparency, which is caused by the progressive loss of privacy. Transparency will be the byproduct of technological progress. It will be feeding into different links, exposing unexpected connections, and fostering the first three of the velocity, interdependence, and complexity dimensions of the future world. The constant interaction of these four forces will mutually reinforce each other, making the world much more susceptible to shocks and surprises, and putting a lot of pressure on contemporary leaders through the daunting challenge of dealing the range of different global and local issues that intersect this extremely complex web of causal links. Wow, you say, what a headache. All this velocity, complexity, transparency is making me really mad. And indeed, many studies found higher rates of psychosis in cities that was first noticed by American psychiatrists in early 1900s. A Danish study not so long ago that looked at health records for almost the entire population of the country found the risk of being diagnosed with schizophrenia increasing in a small but very clear way as people spend more time living in urban environments. The data shows that cities increase the chances of being diagnosed with schizophrenia or having related experiences like paranoia and hallucination. Surprisingly, this is not the case for other mental health problems such as depression or mood instability. Now, the correlation may not be the causality, and there is a lively disagreement among the researchers on whether the cities actually cause madness or whether those affected by madness, quote unquote, or mental health disorders, just tend to end up in the cities. There's a good reasons to think that city living, particularly in deprived neighborhoods, might be the cause of some of these problems. But the alternative explanation could also be that those affected by mental disorders just end up in poor urban neighborhoods, social drift, if you will, that have already been documented as well. Regardless of that, there's a very clear link between urban poverty. 10% increase in a country's rate of urbanization translates in a 10% greater education enrollment ratio. And then the growth, of course, of human capital leads to better outcomes in terms of health, education, research and development. So the urbanization is directly linked to better outcomes for the national populations. It is therefore mission critical for WIGO champions to think holistically. And what do you need to think of? Oh, you need to think of societal transformation. The core attribute of any industrial revolution is a societal shift that these technologies make possible. And they impact more than just economies. They impact our values, our identities, the possibilities for future generations. You will also need to think of a systemic change. The ramification of emerging technologies are required new ways of looking at the world, economically, politically. They will require new regulatory and governance framework to really be as inclusive and sustainable as possible. And for all that, you, WIGO champions, will require a useful mental model. The concept of the fourth industrial revolution was created as an umbrella to make sense of the linkages among that of all these technological advances that are coming from different fields, and they all create profound changes by distributing industrial, economic, and social systems. Now, as we all know, the greatest advances in productivity often follow periods of great disruption. Renaissance, you name it. There are many, many examples. And today we live in a hyper-connected world that is being catapulted to the future that is unknown and without a precedent. The clock speed of societal change has accelerated to the point beyond capacity of conventional comprehension. Technology is already entrenched in our daily life, business, and governance, and are shaping our societies and economies. Future technology choices are now increasingly becoming economic, social, and political ones. This complexity makes it impossible sometimes to establish linear cause-effect relationship so dear to our human hearts. Combined with ever-increasing velocity of change, new ways of creating values for business and societies, the risks that we still yet fully comprehend, and you will understand why many leaders are so desperate for a roadmap that would help them to start understanding and embracing this new and emerging reality. The pandemic forced many governments to accelerate their shift to the cloud as they rushed to reassess their workloads, forecast, and complementary analysis and recommendations, and re-architect their solutions to undertake large-scale cloud migration transformation projects. Due to uncertainty of their technological landscapes, they struggle to efficiently gather data, produce forecasts, and demonstrate successful outcomes on total cost of ownership and of various initiatives. Now, the transition to the cloud has been one of the key shifts in technological paradigm that turn enormous computing resources into utility. Just like during the early days of the second industrial revolution, the electrification became moved away from producing electricity locally in everybody's house and everybody's factory to actually producing the electricity in a centralized fashion and distributing this as a resource, as a utility. But as those parallels emerge, the questions also become, how do we govern these technologies that are driving the fourth industrial revolution so they benefit the society, they benefit the business? How do you adapt to demographic, social, and technological trends that are reshaping education, employment, and entrepreneurship? The very recent World Economic Forum analysis shows that as this year of 2022, no less than 54% of all the employees will require significant reskilling and upskilling. 54%, more than half. Of this, about 35%, or a third, are expected to require additional training of up to 6 months. And 9% will require reskilling that will be lasting up to a year. Another 10% will actually require multi-year reskilling programs. Who in this room is really truly prepared to deal with such a disruption to their workforce? What is our strategy for addressing the skill gaps? This reskilling becomes a mission critical, not only to individuals or to enterprises, but also to the countries. It's an issue of national importance. Through programs like that, you really can actually become much more holistic thinker in addition to being proficient in new technologies, because that will only be part of the 2022 skills equation. Human skills such as creativity, initiative, critical thinking, persuasion, negotiations will retain or increase their value, as will attention to detail, resilience, flexibility, and complex problem solving. Emotional intelligence, leadership, and social influence, as well as service orientation, will be mission critical for the future leaders. How do companies imagine their future strategies to manage the skill gaps that will be widened by these technologies? Well, they fall into three broad categories. Either they expect to hire fully trained permanent staff that already possess all the skills, or they seek to automate the workforce that they have through AI and machine learning system, robotics, and so on, or they're actually committed to retraining their existing employees. 2/3 of the companies expect the workers to adapt and pick up the skills in the course of their changing jobs on their own. Between 1/2 and 2/3 are likely to turn to external contractors, temporary staff, and freelancers to address their skills gap. However, what really worries me today is that nearly 1/4 of companies are still undecided. They have no idea what they want to do with these skills, where they find the workers that they need, how to deal with the skills that are needed for the future. The skills gap forces us to address the ever-growing broader gaps in knowledge that are preventing some stakeholders from fully grasping the opportunities afforded by the fourth industrial revolution. But there are many other gaps. There's a gap between the third and the fourth industrial revolution, the gap between implementation of the digital revolution and ability to grasp the value of the fourth one. There's a gap between hype and fear, because the discussions around technology and society tend to be overly polarized, which is confusing to many and creates inaction. Then there is a gap between the leaders and all the other stakeholders that just keep talking past each other without truly, fully consulting and understanding each other's views. There's a gap between technology and values. We tend to think of values and ethics as an afterthought, but we really need to make sure that this is not the bug of the system, but actually the really cornerstone. And then there's a gap between information and the true contextual intelligence, where leaders don't quite know how technology fits into their huge range of concerns in this volatile world and how and what to prioritize. And of course, there is a gap between digital natives and digital immigrants. As I mentioned, each of the industrial revolutions presented profound systemic change in our lives. The digital revolution altered nearly every industry, once again transforming how people live, work, and communicate. There are always winners and losers. We are all living at a critical moment in history, a turning point for the world. As I mentioned during the opening of the 2020 activities for WeGo, 50 years ago, in 1971, there were very many important societal and tech transformations that were taking place. The voting age in the United States was lowered to 18 years to include many of the leaders that are sitting in front of the screens right now, that were previously not able to vote. When the 26th Amendment of the US Constitution was ratified, it only brought in line the responsibilities that the young people had, such as serving in the army, with the giving them an opportunity to choose the leaders that would make decisions on their behalf. The world political map became a very crowded place with the birth of new states such as Bangladesh, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, some of them through wars and tragedies, some of them peacefully. But today, many of those economies, and I hope there will be participants in the WeGo Champions program from those countries, but those economies are the most dynamic and actually host one of the most amazing cities in the world. But beyond this world, the space became inhabitable for the first time as the first space station, Salyut 1, was launched into low Earth orbit. And another spacecraft, Mariner 9, started orbiting Mars. Back to Earth, China was admitted to the United Nations, and that forever changed the dynamic of international cooperation. In technological news, Intel released the first microprocessor, the 4004. Texas Instrument released the first pocket calculator. The first internet chat appeared. The first CAT scanner was produced by EMI. Today, we take it all for granted. But again, it was even back in Switzerland, where the Edgelands Institute is registered, it was only that year, 1971, when women were granted the right to vote. Before that, half of the population was not able to participate meaningfully in the political life. But there are two developments that I want to really focus, because they are of direct relevance for the Smart Sustainable Cities organization. And that is the birth of NASDAQ, which was a new stock market index, which signaled the true arrival of the digital economy. And also birth and formal creation of Greenpeace, which highlighted the awakening of the civil society to our environmental challenges. Today, 50 years later, we're dealing with the consequences of these developments. And it's mission critical that through the programs such as WeGo Champions, we will continue to incorporate the voices of tomorrow's leaders. Depending on the collective choices that we will make as consumers, as citizens, as communities, the technological breakthroughs that will continue happening can make our cities more prosperous, more sustainable, smarter, and more inclusive. Do we need them to be more sustainable? According to the United Nations, cities consume close to 80% of world's energy and produce 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. Yet they only account for 2% of Earth's surface. We only have one planet to support all human life. And our current economic model, driven by cities, is doing potentially irreparable damage to our environment. The cities absolutely need to be more inclusive. Rapid urbanization is one of the defining forces reshaping today's world. Before the pandemic, each week, roughly 3 million people moved into cities, and that placed a growing pressure on cities around the world. The current attack on globalization, particularly in the developed world, is largely a result of a staggering wealth gap and increased income inequalities. And our cities absolutely need to become more collaborative. They must be respectful of diversity and accept that different nations will have different approaches to development and different concepts of the way in which their economies should be managed and their societies should be governed. But yet those differences should not stop us from collaborating and making our cities better for everyone's tomorrow. The world is looking to you, WeGo Champions, to find the solutions to all these challenges that I outlined. And I'm really pleased that you are decided to take part in this course, decided to participate in the second part of it, where the practical solutioning part of it to these challenges may come from those teams that you will be forming today. Many thanks for your attention.